Welcome to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I founded an eco-conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. Now, I don't just make pottery, I make resources such as books and courses for other potters who want to be more eco-conscious in their pottery practice. And that's what this podcast is all about. It's about me sharing everything I've learned with you, and I can't wait to get started. Let's go! Hello, so before we get on with the episode, I wanted to tell you about two completely free guides that I've made just for you about pottery. And the first guide is called How to Make a Pottery Glaze. So if you've ever been curious about how to make your own pottery glaze, this guide will show you exactly how to make your own glaze from start to finish. It tells you all the ingredients you need. It tells you step by step how to make the glaze, how to stay safe when glaze making, and it's got a stoneware glaze recipe in there. And if you've been curious about how to fire pottery, I have also made a guide on electric kiln firing. So this guide will tell you all the different terms that's used in like kiln firing, and what they mean, and it also takes you through the exact firing schedule that I use to do my bisque firing and also stoneware glaze firing. So it's got all the temperatures in there, all the timings in there, and both of these guides are available from the Oxford Clay website at www.oxfordclay.co.uk/resources for potters. Okay, let's get on with the episode. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. It's so nice to be here with you. In this episode, I wanted to talk to you about glaze testing and like how I actually do glaze testing, because I think it can be, I don't know, like when you get a pottery book out of the library or something and there's loads of glaze tests in there and you think, gosh, it looks kind of really technical, or like how did they do it? But I'm here to tell you it's not. You can do it too, All it is really is step one, having something to test your glaze on, and step two, making a glaze test, joining those two things together by dipping the test in the glaze. And then step three is just firing it. So I'm going to talk you through some cool things I've learned along the way in terms of testing different glazes, how to basically make glaze tests, and I hope you'll find this episode useful. So like I said, the first thing is that you need something to test your glaze on. Okay, so this is essentially something that has been bisque fired, and then you can make all these glaze tests at one time, and you can just store them ready to test your glazes when you're ready to test a new glaze. So there's different ways in the past that I've done this. So for all the books that I've written for Oxford Clay, I've used this standard glaze test of a kind of dish with a dragonfly in the middle. So I'm just holding up one now. So if you're listening on the podcast, it's just like a round dish, and it's got dragonfly, just like a dragonfly motif just in the middle. And the reason I use this shape is that it's got like this, so it's basically the kind of little dish type shape. So I know that if a glaze runs, or something goes wrong with it, it's kind of, I don't want it to stick to my kiln shelf. So this has kind of got like a really good kind of middle bit. I can test glazes, the glaze like pools in the middle basically. So it's all pooling there in the middle, and I know that it's not going to stick to my kiln shelf. Even if it's very, very runny, it's going to be safely contained there in the middle. I can put it on quite thick to test how it looks really thick, and it'll all just be there sort of like safely in the middle of the dish. And the reason I use a dragonfly design is that I want to see how the glaze looks if it's kind of put over some kind of texture. And I just find the dragonfly a nice thing to like test on. But you can use, if you wanted to scratch something in the surface of a glaze test, it's just really good to know what it's like on a kind of a surface where it might be a little bit rougher, or you might have a design that you want to show through. Different glazes will kind of obscure a design in different ways. So that's why I do the design. It's just, you just want to see how it looks really through how the glaze looks over a design, like how the design looks through that glaze is a really helpful thing to know. Okay, so you can make like little things, dishes to test your glazes, or you can also cut up pottery that you're making on the wheel. So I've done another episode actually on the podcast about like some cool things to do if your pot goes wrong, inverted commas, wrong. And chopping your pot up into like little sections is a really good way of kind of like reusing it and making it into some glaze tests. So you would do this when the pot is like leather hard, usually, because that's much easier to cut it when it's leather hard. So you would do it before you bisque fired the pot and before the pot was dry. So yeah, so the great thing about cutting a pot that you've made on the wheel up into different sections to test glazes is that you will automatically have a part of the base. So the glaze test will stand up, and then you'll automatically have a vertical surface to test the glaze on. So the only thing to say about these, for testing your glaze on a vertical surface is really what you want, because that's kind of, how the glaze is going to behave like on an actual pot. If you, dip a pot in it, it's going to have this vertical surface, and you really want to know how that glaze is going to go. The only thing I'd say is that it's a great idea to leave like quite a large bit of like clay at the bottom when you come to actually test your glazes, because quite often metal oxides, if you're testing some, say like new colours or something, they can act as a flux and they can actually make your glaze more runny, and and it can run down and like stick to the kiln shelf, and it's just like you don't want to be like losing kiln shelves by having these things stuck to them, or having to like chisel off stuff, so which by the way you should always use safety glasses if you're chiseling off anything off your kiln shelf. Always use safety glasses, just had to say that. So it can be so sharp, the glaze essentially is like a glass, so it can be incredibly sharp when a shard will stick to the kiln shelf. It literally like razor sharp, so just be like super careful if that does happen. Yeah, I have actually cut myself before on bits of things that have run onto the shelf, and then it's broken the pot and left this very sharp shard stuck to the kiln shelf. So yeah, that's a top tip for testing glazes on that kind of like, vertical surface. Just leave a huge amount at the bottom of free of glaze. So even if it does run, it's going to be okay. It's not going to stick to a kiln shelf. Okay, so, yeah, okay, so those are the kind of two ways that I create a base to test a glaze on. So little dishes, and then, cross sections of pots, little slices of pots. Okay, so the next thing is that it's a really good idea, like I said, to just make like lots of these. So you have them in advance, you can just like, keep them in a little box or something. And then when you come to test your glazes, you've got them all right there. A really good thing to do before you actually fire the glaze tests is to stamp some kind of mark in it to enable you to test to like tell all the glazes apart. So you could scratch it, with an old kind of pencil or something. You can scratch a number or a letter in it. I actually have some metal letters that I can press into the bottom of the glaze test. So this one is, I'm holding up my glaze test, is ZZ. So so ZZ, it's really good. That's not gonna rub off. It's just I've pressed the letters ZZ into that glaze test, and then in my glazing notebook I write ZZ, and then I know whatever I'm testing, that's not going to kind of rub off. Or you can write with metal oxides, say like a black iron oxide or something. You can write on the bottom of a glaze test when it's been bisque fired. But I do find that pressing letters and numbers into a glaze test is such a good way of having like a kind of permanent record of what that glaze test is, which one it is. Right, so So you've got your glaze tests, you've got them all fired, they're all bisque fired, ready to go. And the next thing is that you want to actually make your glaze tests. Okay, so I've done another episode on kind of how to read a glaze recipe, but what you're doing is you're going to make a tiny version of that glaze. So say for example you have a glaze which is a recipe which is like 40 parts, so they'll always be done in parts and they should add up to 100 for the basic glaze, and then they will have the oxides and water on top. And water, they won't, recipes don't tell you how much water to put in, but the metal oxides, they're usually done as a percentage. And it'll be as a percentage on top of that base glaze recipe. So like I said, there's a whole episode on this where I sort of like go into it in more detail and explain it and stuff. But essentially that's what you're doing. You're going to make a little tiny version of a recipe. So for example, let's take a recipe which is 40 parts plant ash. So it could be like, wood ash or something from wood burning stove, or, any kind of other plant ash that you've burned, that you've created. So it could be 40 parts plant ash, 40 parts Cornish stone, which is a type of degraded quartz, and then it could be 20 parts quartz. So that's the recipe I actually use for all my pottery. And then I add water on top, and then I paint on recycled metal oxides, which I make myself. So, right, okay, so if you were going to do a glaze test of that one, what I found is that the little dishes that I make, I found that actually 50 grams of glaze powder, of the glaze powder, is actually enough to glaze a little dish. And the thing about glaze testing is you kind of like, it's quite hard to make very, very tiny amounts, but you don't want like loads of this glaze test, because if it turns out to be a glaze that you don't really like, you've got all this glaze. So it is a really good idea to maybe make like 100 grams of it, of dry weight of it, and then add a little bit, add a water to make it up to the glaze, or 50 grams if you can. So my top tip for this is to get some scales which can do some weighing scales. So I just use kitchen weighing scales to make my glazes. So my top tip for this is to get a glaze get scales which can actually measure in 0.5 grams. So that will enable you to use, so say for example, you're then adding, metal oxide, say like verdigris or something, which you can make yourself. So say like you're making 50 grams of that glaze, say you're adding 3% of verdigris, you need to half it, because you're not making 100, you're not making 100 grams, you're going to need to half it. So you're going to need 1.5 grams of verdigris. So I hope that makes sense. So if you're making 100 grams of that glaze test, you would need 3% of verdigris, which would be 3 grams. But because you're going to make just like an even smaller glaze test of like 50 grams, you just need to half that amount, because 50 is half of 100. So you'd need 1.5 grams of verdigris. So it is such a good idea if you're making these little tests to have scales that can cope with those tiny amounts. So like I said, I just got kitchen scales, and some kitchen scales will go down to 1 gram, and some kitchen scales will go down even smaller, even to 0. I've seen kitchen scales that can do 0.1 grams, but the kitchen scales I've got, they just go down to 0.5 of a gram. And I find that's enough for the glaze testing that I do. Another thing that I really need to tell you is that if you're making glazes, you really, really have to be wearing your FFP3 face mask. Your lungs can get damaged basically from the silica dust that are in the powdered rocks that you're going to be using to make your glaze. So that is really, really, really important. You can get it from hardware shops, you can get it from pottery suppliers, but you have to have an FFP3 face mask to protect your lungs when you're working with any kind of powders in pottery. Okay, safety lecture over. Okay, so the next thing to tell you is that what I usually do is I kind of usually make up my 50 grams of, of glaze test. I usually add a little bit of water at the beginning to try and get, because it's very difficult to mix a very, very, tiny glaze sometimes because, you're adding the water and you've got lumps in there and, you can't just kind of get a stick blender out and blend it or something, so what I normally do is I normally kind of try and mix it into a paste first of all, and then I add a little bit more water and then just kind of make it, running it and running it to try and get all those lumps out at that stage. And then it creates like this nice smooth glaze. So you can actually sieve your glaze as well. If you're making a glaze with metal oxides, it is a great idea to sieve it because that will really help the oxides to kind of break up properly, disperse throughout the glaze. It's a really good idea. So you can buy these like little sieves from pottery suppliers. You want to be maybe using sort of like 100 sieve, maybe 120 mesh size. 120 mesh size if you're going to be, using like metal oxides. That will really disperse the metal oxides really well, like into that glaze, and it will make sure there's no lumps in the glaze. So you've got your lovely glaze, you've got your glaze test, and the next thing is just either to, dip that glaze test into the glaze, or, maybe you could paint it on if, it's quite hard to control sometimes a tiny amount of glaze. I usually have another bowl actually, which I'm sort of pouring my glaze onto my glaze test, and I have another bowl to collect all the glaze. And because you've hardly got any of that glaze, I then usually pour it then back on again, into another bowl. You can keep on reusing that glaze, just keep on collecting it. Don't let it sort of like go anywhere down the sink or anything. Let it just keep on using that glaze until you're satisfied that the whole of your glaze test is got the right amount of glaze on. And then, like I said, make sure there's none on the bottom, and it's a really great idea to kind of, make sure you've got some nice free clay there at the bottom with no glaze on, up the side a little bit, so that you're not going to be worrying about it running onto the kiln shelf. That's how I test all my glazes. And like I said to you, I love glaze testing. It's something that I really, really love. And every time I get, some kind of really great like glaze tests, I really love sharing them because it's quite a lot of work in terms of like, mixing the recipe, making the glaze, putting it on a glaze test, and then, firing it. And it's just so good to share the results of them. And there's a really fantastic website actually called glazy.org. So if you want to see, if you want a recipe and you're not really sure where to go, glazy.org is a free website where loads of potters are doing all these glaze testing, taking photos of them, uploading them so you can see what they look like. You can search by keywords, you can search by the temperature to fire out, you can search by the colour, you can search by ingredient, you can type in ash and get ash glazes. So glazy.org is such a good resource for potters. So if you're kind of stuck for like where to get ideas for glaze recipes, that is a brilliant resource. So happy glaze testing. It's been so nice talking to you about how I glaze test. And like I said to you, you can do it, if you can make, you can make any kind of recipe cooking, you can make a glaze. It's just putting those ingredients together, in the right parts, basically ratio, adding water, and then, putting it on your pot. So it's been so nice talking to you about glaze testing, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you on the next episode of the podcast. And until then, wishing you very happy potting. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for joining me for the Oxford Clay Pottery podcast. If you're interested in learning more about Oxford Clay or eco-conscious pottery, there's so much for you on the Oxford Clay website. There's books, e-courses, there's a blog on there, loads of other podcast episodes, and I can't wait to share it with you. The web address is oxfordclay.co.uk. I'll see you over there.